for Alexander, and it's always a question. He'd been in Egypt, and actually he'd done something rather strange in Egypt, which you mentioned Zeus Ammon. Well, Zeus Ammon has a famous shrine in the far western side of Egypt, really towards Libya, in the desert, in an oasis called Siwa. So what on earth was Alexander doing, going on this very dangerous side trip, 250 kilometers, when Darius is waiting for him in Iraq, as we would call it? Why doesn't he get over the Euphrates and take him on? Well, it's part of Alexander's charm and mystique that he was concerned to get the gods on his side and to prove to his troops they were going to win because the gods were on Alexander's side. They deserted, as it were, the Persians. So he crosses the Euphrates, he marches up into the plain, and he's faced with something of the order of, now figures are always inflated, the sources are all Greek, they're not Persian, so they tend to enlarge them, but the figure given is something over 1 million. Well, we think probably 200, 300,000. Even so, absolutely vastly outnumbers Alexander's troops of 50,000, something like that. And Alexander, therefore, has a major morale problem, which he solves. And I think it was Napoleon who said that the morale factor to all other factors in warfare is as 3 to 1. The morale factor is 3 times as important as all the other factors in warfare. So he's up against elephants, he's up against scythed chariots, he's up against huge outnumbering of forces, and yet he wins.
Can we go to you, Rachel? How did he win? Then we've heard about his strategies and his mentions, his generalship. Can you give us, what was he doing that was so much better than what anybody else was doing?
Well, he's doing things that are a lot better than other people are doing in some ways, but there are areas where I think it's important to remember that Alexander did face very formidable opposition that he wasn't necessarily capable of withstanding in the way that he had
But he won this battle that Paul's been describing.
Yes, he did.
So how did he do it, if it was, say, 50,000 against 250,000?
I think an important factor is what Paul's already mentioned, which is the Macedonian military technology and military training. The equipment they're using, the discipline among the troops, and also the factor of morale being extremely important as well.
When you say technology, is it these long 18-foot spears that, again, was mentioned earlier?
Yes, using the sarissa and the formation of marching and fighting in those as well.
And that did the trick?
Apparently so.
What sort of victory was it? Did Darius flee the field and so on?
Yes. Darius, after his major defeats, as a ruler, really loses a lot of authority. Now, the Persian Empire itself fights on for quite a long time, but Darius is deposed by one of his own governors, a guy called Bessos, and is captured and taken off in chains by Bessos in the flight of the main Persian army up into Central Asia, into what's now Afghanistan.
And we've been talking very fluently about what he did, Diana Spencer, but what I get from reading what you've all written is that the evidence is patchy. So can you just tell the listeners how patchy it is? I mean, as it were, own up.
Own up to the fact that we're all spinning stories here. I think before I say what evidence we do have, it's interesting just to mention a couple of very famous omissions that we think existed, but we no longer have. And one of the most important is the history of the campaign that was apparently written as the campaign was progressing by Alexander's official historian, Callisthenes. And Callisthenes is an interesting figure because he's the nephew of Aristotle, who Rachel mentioned was Alexander's tutor.
But does that still exist?
That doesn't still exist, I'm afraid. But some of the historians that we do have claim to have seen it or claim to have used it. The other thing that no longer exists, but that we believe did exist, was something that was a sort of daily log of the campaign, a day book, in effect. That also is gone, but again, we believe that some of the first wave of historians will have been consulting it.
The first wave of historians was several hundred years later.
Well, the very first wave of historians may actually have been very close to Alexander, so men such as Ptolemy, for example. So Ptolemy, who goes on to become king of Egypt, making his capital in Alexandria.
But we have records from him, do we?
We don't actually have records from him. I know, this is starting to get terrible, isn't it? But
yep.
What we understand to be Ptolemy's history is most clearly represented in the history of Arrian.
Which is when?
And Arrian is writing in the 200s AD.
So that's 300 or 400 years years later, as I suggested.
Well, late first, early second, yes.
So how bad does it get, Paul?
It depends what you're looking for. I mean, I'm a fan of Arrian, not everybody is. He modelled himself on Xenophon, and he actually called himself Xenophon, but he was writing in the first half of the 2nd century. He was both Greek and Roman, as it were. He came from what's now Turkey, but he was a consul in Rome, and he was archon in Athens, and so on. Well, he used Ptolemy. He also used a guy called Aristobulus, who was an engineer or an architect, for example, was asked by Alexander to repair the temple, the tomb of Cyrus, the founder of the Persian Empire, at Pasargadae.
But the general drift of what you've been saying, you tell listeners this is reliable enough or reliable?
Well, I think, as Diana just suggested, historians always write influenced by their own times and the things that are going on in their own culture and society. But if I can add a word of not necessarily support, but empathy for ancient historians, they're engaged in the same project that a lot of us as historians in the present day are. We work with the primary sources that we have as close to the time that we're writing about. We work with secondary sources and we build our own construction of events based on that. And unfortunately, a lot of the primary sources from close to the date of Alexander don't survive. So we can hope or deconstruct in the hope that these historians have worked with these sources and used them well.
Back to Paul Cartledge. After the Persian heartlands, Alexander, I suppose by then known as the Invincible, or coming known as the Great, moved towards India.
Yeah.
What did he expect to find? What did you think he was doing?
Well, he moved there, of course, via Afghanistan. And the thought is that this had once been part of the Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus, which achieved its greatest expansion in the second half of the 6th century, but by this time was beyond the purview of the Persians. So what's he doing? Well, there is one strategic explanation which is not often thought of, which is that any empire has to have frontiers. And though Alexander seems to have been more keen than most to expand them, to go on forever, nevertheless, you have to be worrying all the time about what's next, just beyond your frontier. The Roman Empire is a classic case of this. Why did Julius Caesar invade Britain, for example? So the strategic explanation of the Indian campaign is that he's wrapping up his eastern frontier. The romantic explanation, which is of course what the sources go for, Heracles had been there, Dionysus had been there, I'm going to go there, and therefore it's unnecessary. And since some of the fighting in what's today, of course now Pakistan, Kashmir, involved extremely unpleasant repression of local troops, local peoples who were not keen to be reincorporated in an empire of the West, as they would have seen it. Therefore, this is unnecessary. This is Alexander's showboating and merely gratifying his own base instincts for slaughter. Well, that isn't my view, but it is a view.
Diana Spencer.
I mean, I think Paul's mention there of the romantic view of this extension into India also finds strong resonances in Roman rhetoric. And actually the Romans speculated quite extensively as to whether what Alexander really wanted to do was to find the encircling ocean that was the final boundary, the final frontier.
Yes, the idea was that the landmass was encircled by one sea and he was going to get
exactly.
there.
So that kind of notion that Alexander was somebody who wanted to go beyond even where Dionysus and Heracles had gone. Someone who was going to push the boundaries of reality as well as of fact.
Can I ask you, Rachel, and people, what was his state of mind? We have this man still young, he's still in his late 20s, he's marched for thousands of miles already with this, as Paul has pointed out at the very beginning of the programme, with incredibly, and you pointed out, drilled army, which is winning and winning and winning and winning. What's his state of mind? Who does he think he is?
That's the big question. Has he lost touch with reality, I suppose, would be another way of putting it. And I'd add to what Paul and Diana have been saying about the campaigns in India and Central Asia, that he's facing a local enemy at this point, but he's also facing opposition from within his own army, which in some ways he's out of touch with. So in Central Asia, he spends 3 years there, which is an incredibly long time for what essentially are hill tribes and small, non-urbanized groups of people. He ends up having to leave the place garrisoned with small groups of Greek and Macedonian soldiers, who absolutely hate being there. And this is something that the ancient sources are very clear on. The geographer Strabo, writing later, says that you can't grow olives in Central Asia. And I suppose we could use that as a benchmark of what, to an ancient Greek, is a definition of a civilized place to live. So he's got opposition potentially building there. And when there's a rumour that Alexander has been killed in India, in fact he was only wounded, all of these Greeks revolt and attempt to return to the Mediterranean. And as he gets into India, this opposition within the army builds until the point at which he finally has to turn back. I think it's important to remember it's not just the opposition of local people, the difficulties of the supply chain and terrain and climate, it's also the fact that his army will go no further.
And it's also to do with his behaviour and the way, as we learned from what I learned from what you've written. Can you briskly take us through what he was doing that earned the disrespect of the army that had led to so many victories?
Yeah, you've got to distinguish between the inner court and the troops as a whole. And I'll just single out one episode which to me is quite extraordinary. And we're now coming quite a long way down.
Yeah.
We're coming